All right, you see the suspense building as we admit everyone from the waiting room. So the Zoom room, we now have everyone in the meeting, and I'm sure people will continue to trickle in as they do in person as well. But we'll get going. It's 4 p.m., which in the time that I lived in Germany was coffee hour, which was a great time. And I adopted that tradition and definitely gained a bit of weight while I was living in Germany. And the other hour that unfortunately we're not serving coffee, but you'll have a tiny taste of pie for those of you who are here in person. And we're turning off those lights.
No, you want them on?
I don't know. Zoom crowd, can you still see me? Camera's pretty good. Okay.
Good.
We'll leave it like that. And so welcome, I'm Jacquelyn Sundberg. I'm Outreach Librarian, and I'm going to start off with a couple of housekeeping notes. I'm going to introduce our panelist who's zooming in. Marcy's on screen in the corner for now, but I'll give her a proper introduction in a minute. And Kristen is here in the room. So this is a true hybrid event in that we have folks here in the chairs, we have folks in their comfy chairs or sofas at home. That is a perk of the home crowd. However, you don't get any pie. So there's a trade-off there. So a couple of housekeeping notes for those of you who are here in person. The washrooms are back down the gallery hall at the far end if you need them, and the emergency exit is out that way as well, or there is one at the back of the room as well. For Zoom, I have my colleague Labiba here who will be monitoring chat throughout the event. And another piece of not housekeeping, but mindfulness. We start all of our events with an acknowledgement of the place that we're in. So we're joining you and we're here on site of the McGill's downtown campus. And McGill University is located on land which has long served as a place of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. And we honor and recognize and respect these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which we meet today. I hope for those of you who are tuning in from afar that you take a moment to tell us where you're tuning in from, even if it's just down the street. One of the realities of our current era, I don't want to say post-COVID because it's not truly, it's part of our lives now. So one of the realities of now is that we offer hybrid events so that people who maybe are immunocompromised or who are more comfortable tuning in from home, or in the case of today's event, Marcy is tuning in from home for a number of those reasons as well, or being exposed to someone who's COVID positive. So we thank all of you for whom that's the case for staying home and tuning in remotely. So thank you for tuning in from where you are, but do pop a note in the chat, which is open, and you can send us questions and comments throughout the event. That is actually my last note of housekeeping. Woohoo, it's short, right? There's no, yeah, no, it's not really funny, but thank you, Chris. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we will make that big for everyone. Now, for the moment, you're seeing all of the other things on my desktop. Let me close a couple windows before I pass the microphone. And we'll make that full screen. Okay, I'm going to invite Christopher Lyons, the Associate Dean of ROAAR, up to give some opening comments about what today is in addition to the day after Pi Day. So take it away, Chris.
There you go. Well, see, if I were the Three Stooges, I would be throwing this at someone right now, or I would be tripping and it would fall right in my face. I just wanted the people who are watching virtually, oh, we have a pie camera. Okay, I was just gonna okay, but this is, do you have smell-o-rama? This is a sugar pie, right? This is, we'll just be looking for here. No, what? That way you people are here. Oh, this is so fun. I got to give Jacquelyn and everyone credit for this because I've never had so much fun with these events than I've had the past few years. And in the not post-COVID era has just been wonderful for that. And the chance to be here and do things like this is really, really tremendous. Now, you may or may not know, or you may be wondering why some of us are wearing T-shirts or buttons that say McGill 24. Now, if you grew up in the 70s and 80s like I did, 24 is associated with beer and cases of 24 or 24, but that's not the purpose of this. This is another McGill 24. And what I should explain and what this 24 is it's a 24-hour fundraising. And it's a really exciting activity that takes place once a year. This is the 8th annual one, where there are challenge grants. Now, it's interesting because this one is not predicated on, if you raise X amount of money, you'll get Y amount of money. It's based on the number of people who donate any amount will release the funds. And so the challenge grant for us is 225 donors. And I don't know what the count is at the moment. I know when I last checked, we're at 110. All right. So we need 115 more donors. Now, the thing is, it could be any amount. So if you go online and donate $1 115 times, you will release, but we don't share it with you, but you will release $123,000. So we're, I don't know if you can donate a cent at a time, but we'd be $1.15 away from $123,000. But that's where we're at. I chose to donate a little bit more than $1, but please do so if you haven't. It's a fun thing. And like I said, the amount is, you donate is not important. It's that you donated, which is participation. That's right. That's the word. That's my colleague, Stephen Spodek. He's the development officer at McGill. He has threatened to beat me up if I don't raise enough money. So I might be spending much of the evening. If you don't pitch in, it'll be me, because I like walking. I want to do that. Anyway, just to tell you, as you may know, there's the Fiat Lux project coming to McGill, which is going to be a substantial redevelopment and rebuild of the library, which will allow us to give so much more of the sorts of activities and spaces that we have found have been so much in demand, not only for McGill students, but for the general public, Montrealers, researchers from around the world who come to benefit from our spaces and our activities. More than ever, library spaces and library services are seen as critical for student experience and student success. And not just in the sense that one traditionally does, is to come in for books. It's the space that has the equipment for them to do all kinds of things that you couldn't do at home with expensive computers, or to sit and be inspired by the art that's around you, or the special collections, or those of you who notice our printing press having it's called a book arts lab, or just seeing your fellow students working away or being inspired by beautiful views of the mountain or the city. This is going to be spectacular. It'll be a literal palace of learning, and it'll be open to all Montrealers, all Quebecers, all Canadians, everyone from around the world. So opportunities like this to support the library are really important to us. And I want to thank you for being here. And I want you to, you can, after this talk, once you've wiped all the sugar from your hands, you might want to get on your phones or your computers and consider making a donation. Thank you very much. I'll now turn the microphone over to Jacquelyn. Thank you.
So thank you, Chris. I'm going to invite Kristen Howard up to the podium. And now I'm going to introduce who you see on screen as well. This is Marcy Goldman. So when I was putting together the notes for this program, everyone's waving to you, Marcy. We'll give you a quick view of the room.
Oh my. Hi, everybody. It's a real hello. It's not even an emoticon. It's real. This part's not virtual. It's real.
So let me, the proper little bios we'll do here. In addition to being outreach librarian, I'm also now the curator of our cookbook collection, which of course got me thinking of all the different things that we could do with cookbooks events-wise. So here we are with Pi Day, and I have to thank Kristen Howard, first in the alphabet. Wait, wrong. I'm first in the alphabet, so I went first. Sorry, Kristen second, JK, right? Kristen Howard is our liaison librarian for history, classics, Indigenous studies, and religious studies at the library here. And that area of responsibility changes from time to time, but she is also a historian. She has a PhD in history and a keen interest in food history. On top of that, she's also a vegan, so offers a perspective that's different from my own on baking pie, which often calls for high animal fat content. So we'll hear a little bit more about that. And Last but not least in the alphabet, Marcy Goldman. On screen here is a Montreal-based cookbook author and professional trained pastry chef, as well as a McGill English grad. We have a McGill alumni on screen, like myself, we share that. She's a contributor to the Washington Post, Costco Magazine, and she hosts her own baking site, betterbaking.com, since 1997. She is currently at work on a new cookbook on breads, which will be her 15th cookbook title. And she also mentioned one on Montreal restaurant menus and recipes. Well,
Yeah, Montreal foods and stuff.
Montreal foods. So today you've had a nice view of the pie, but I think Libby, you can actually turn off the pie camera now and we'll make Marcy's face full screen. There you go. So we come together for a few reasons, and I'll explain our rather mathematical title because today is March 15th, McGill's Day of Giving, but it's also the day after Pi Day, 3.14, which is the first 2 digits of pi. So we decided that we could stretch that to 3.1415, which is the first 4 digits of pi if you don't round correctly, and have our pie event today on March 15th. So across the country yesterday, Kristen and I participated. Librarians and enthusiasts tried out recipes, historical recipes, and baked from the collections. And they used the hashtag GLPBO if you want to take a dive on social media and look at the successes and failures of other people, Kristen and myself included.
Which stands for a Great Library Pie Bake Off, in case you're wondering.
Yes. So they tried their hands at doing this on Unpie Day, as they call it. So welcome to our discussion of how Unpie Day went. And I have to say, I'm a little bit relieved, actually, Marcy, that you are joining us remotely and you can't taste my pie as you are a professional baker. I'm definitely not. So
It's not a fair fight. Not a fair fight. They looked lovely. I saw them from a distance. They look lovely.
Well, thank you.
So I thought we'd start off with a round table for our round pies. And we'll just go around and talk about the recipes that we chose and how the process went. And I'll let the alphabet dictate this order of preference as well. And I guess that means I go first. Actually, I scrap that. Kristen, you go first.
I would love to go first. This is my second time participating in Pi Day, where I've looked into the McGill Cookbook Collection and I ended up using the same cookbook again. Something that I thought would be interesting to choose a recipe and veganize it, since I'm a vegan. I chose a 1915 version of the 5 Roses cookbook. Jacquelyn has pulled the French version here. I used the English version.
It's quite lovely for a 1915 book.
It's really quite
nice. It's a very nice object.
I had a couple of reasons that I was interested in using this cookbook. One is because since it's from the time of the First World War, that's a time when a lot of home cooks and home bakers were already having to substitute ingredients. So it wouldn't be that unusual to not have enough butter or eggs in particular and to need to think of a more creative ingredients for your pie. So that's one reason that this time period kind of speaks to me as someone who often does a lot of substitutions when baking. I don't bake that often and pies very seldom, mostly just for Pi Day. I was also interested in this because it's a Montreal-based company, and these cookbooks are, according to 5 Roses, all of the versions of these cookbooks, which first were published in 1913 and have been published kind of continuously since, they're all recipes sent into 5 Roses by Canadian home cooks. And I think that that's a really kind of fun and interesting thing. And one of my favorite cookbooks that my mom had on our shelf when I was growing up was a cookbook that was all recipes gathered from her lady friends in college. She went to college out of state. It was quite unusual at the time. And she always had this recipe book on the shelf. And I thought it was always fun to look at and see all of these women who had been very important in her life and who now were, very distant to look at. So I thought it was very fun to choose a cookbook that similarly was from women all over Canada. This year, I chose the carrot pie recipe. I've never had carrot pie before. I've never really heard of carrot pie before. That's basically why I chose it. It seemed kind of fun and different. And I would say mine's the kind of darker colored one up here, the only one without decoration too. So you can see what a good baker I am. I thought that it would just be kind of fun. I figured it had to be pretty similar to a pumpkin pie or a sweet potato pie, which is something I'm a little bit more comfortable with. So it was a little different, but not so different that it was kind of too scary for me. So that's kind of that's my pie intro.
Yeah. Well, my pie intro, I started in some ways in the same way in that there's a nostalgic connection to lemon pie. I think there's a lot of nostalgia that's tied to pie in general, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But that fueled my choice also because my father would make two kinds of pie, banana cream and lemon meringue. And I always thought the meringue was disgusting and didn't like it. It's just mousse on top that the mouthfeel of meringue was not my favorite. So I went hunting for lemon pie recipes, and in reality, there are myriad lemon pie recipes, and they have been around for a long time. And as the curator of the cookbook collection, I was like, challenge, let's see what I can find. And we have cookbooks dating back from 19th century. Most of the holdings, it's stronger and more representational for the 20th century, and particularly 1950 to the year 2000. That's the largest strength of our collection. We have a lot of community cookbooks, actually, like the one that your mother had. And I tried to dive in and find a recipe that would be kind of typical for the late 1900s. I found one. It was this book here, the New Galt Cookbook. And what I found when I tried to use it, the recipe, is that recipes have changed a lot since 1898. We'll talk about that too. But long story short, I chose a recipe for lemon pie. I tried the pastry and it was a complete fail. You can look at my photos on Twitter. It didn't go well. It was sandy. And I think where I went wrong was in 1898, they measured their flour in coffee cups. And I didn't do the due diligence of looking up how much a coffee cup might have been in 1898. It's not the same as a standard 250 ml cup measurement now, nor is it the same as our standard coffee cup now. Yeah, coffee cups today are much bigger unless you're in Italy. So not a useful measurement for me. So the pie crust was a fail. So I went looking later in time. So you have an attempt from 1898, and then you have the actual recipe from 1950, which I find was a golden era for pies, as well as color printing. So I picked a recipe also from a promotional commercial cookbook. This one is for Robin Hood flour, velvet touch pastry and cake flour. So that's where this particular recipe for lemon pie comes from. And in the end, I think it turned out okay, but not wonderful. We'll see when we taste it later on today. So with that preamble, I will pass it over to Marcy to tell us about her recipe choices.
Well, I'm very impressed with, I think you did do a lot of due diligence. I love going through all those cookbooks. For my pie, and actually the velvet cookbook, I have 80 pounds of Robin Hood velvet flour in my house right now. So that's still going strong. And that's like a cake and pastry flour. So, and to me, that's like Canada's white gold is our flour. But I chose a sugar pie and I did a lot of research, and like the lemon pie, oddly, there's myriad versions of sugar pie. I don't know why, because it's pie crust, basically maple syrup or brown sugar and cream. And to that, people vary it. They add, the proportions change quite a bit over the years. Back in the day, they used maple syrup, maple sugar, and heavy cream. If you see the recipes on the internet or even in older cookbooks morphing through to today, they swapped in brown sugar, which is cheaper and as ubiquitous as maple syrup was in, 1700. But what I like about it, it's spring and it's maple season is starting. So it's the quintessential spring pie, even though it's kind of very warm and caramelized and everything. What I find fascinating about it is very gelatinous looking when it's baking. And I'm always tempted to put in cornstarch or an egg, and I've been baking a long time. And it's jiggly, but it always does you proud. And it made me look up why did Quebecers use maple syrup? Because the rest of the world around that time, the States and Europe, were using brown sugar. And I think it was just so copious and so much cheaper. It tastes delicious. And it was just easier to use. And I think it probably, as brown sugar became more common, they switched it. And as maple syrup also began going up in price quite a bit. But there's a lot of similar recipes in the States. They have a chess pie, which is very similar. And the one that I think, I don't know if you posted the recipe, but I'm happy to share it with everyone, has its roots in northwestern France, I think, and they call it tarte au sucre. But theirs is a yeasted pastry crust. And this is, I think, 1700 or so. they patted that down, and then they boiled up a syrup of brown sugar and cream, or probably cream at that point, poured it over the crust, and then dotted it with cubes of butter and baked it. And so, of course, you have the syrup and butters like suffusing the your bottom yeasted crust, which is really more pastry than pie, although pie is a pastry. And I think probably things transmuted a little bit when they got to Quebec. You had to be, a lot faster. I don't think, I'm not even sure what they were using for yeast. It had to be a sourdough starter. There wasn't really instant yeast or the yeast, commercial yeast as we know it, till, I don't know, about 1900 or so. I'm not quite sure when that was launched. Anyway, it's something so simple, so indigenous to our culture, especially in Quebec. And if you like pecan pie but don't like nuts, this pie's for you.
For me. So a question for you. You mentioned that this was a yeasted dough. Is that's not something I'm familiar with. Was there a leavening agent in your pie?
No, this is the French version from France. I was surprised at that. But there's roots to everything. I mean, they may have been basing it, most places, whatever they cook, certainly, and by extrapolation, what people bake is based on indigenous ingredients. Things have to be plentiful. You don't have state-of-the-art ovens and other equipment. So it's going to be a little bit quick and dirty. I think a yeasted dough, though, it's an odd choice. And because before that, pastry was largely from the Middle Ages. You have puff pastry, which came from phyllo dough, which came from even as far back as the Crusades. So something morphed in France, and then we made it our own in this part of the world.
So you've actually segued really nicely. I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of pie and how, in some ways, every culture has a version of pie, whether it's hand pies, like dough wrapped around a filling, which honestly, it's my favorite food everywhere I found it in the world, whether it's dumplings or empanadas or meat pies or Jamaican patties. There's a version of a pie, it's particularly a hand pie, all around the world. So I know, Marcy, you mentioned that you're a McGill English grad, and when we were preparing for this, you told me that you once made a recipe, a pie recipe out of Beowulf. So that takes us back a little bit. Do you want to kind of fill in some of that pie history? Yeah, some of the filling. Yes, yes.
Yes, that was my have-to course. If you're an English grad at McGill, you have to study Beowulf. And we had an end-of-term project, and everyone was doing some sort of dissertation on some aspect, and I chose what I researched to be what could have possibly been the food of that time. And I found a lot of pork things, a lot of even sweet things that were preserved in pork fat, and huge mixture of savory and sweet, which now we're very divisive about. Well, we have salty sweet, but then they put peas preserved in pork fat, made with honey and stuff like that. So nothing was edible. And I went back as far as I could possibly go to recreate. I think the only edible part is another student and I, we made a big vat of mead. His father had a restaurant, and that was palatable. I mean, with that much alcohol, nobody seemed to begrudge it as being inauthentic or authentic enough.
So inedible Beowulf pie is the conclusion.
Yes.
Not palatable to a modern pie taster.
It's amazing what people used to eat, and even we morph a lot. People don't even eat quiche that much anymore. It was like a trend, things go in and out of vogue, and very whimsical things, avocado toast. You never really, I don't know if it's as economically tied as it used to be way back then. I mean, you're growing food, you use what you have on hand. And the expertise, I mean, you didn't have TikTok showing you how to make a souffle. So more rudimentary, I think. Yeah.
I think one of the things as I was looking into pie, I also associate it as a very British food, but that's my own experience. So you can find in every British pub, you'll have some kind of a meat pie. And I think the tradition of British pies is one that's alive and strong in Quebec today. We have a mixed tradition here. We have pies of French descent, like the one that you made today, and we have pies of a more English flavor here as well. But do you think you mentioned this tradition of sugar pie here in Quebec, very tied to maple sugar. Do you think that there's this French influence of sugar pie or that outside of Quebec? Do you see that influence spreading beyond our borders?
I think so. I mean, I think this definitely came from our French ancestry and settlement here in Quebec. But if you look to southern, I was saying to someone the other day, I mean, we all had different ingredients, wherever you lived regionally, and all things being equal, let's say 1600s, 1700s. So, but why? But southern bakers like are phenomenal, and they're phenomenal with their pies. But they have sugar pies, but they're called chess pies. They have a lot of pecans. It's very, very similar. They add eggs and they have pecans, and their sugar pie really is their pecan pie. I think things just catch on with certain trends. And as they say, like, I think a lot of Southern settlers originally came, there was the Virginia brides from England. A lot of brides came from England to Virginia. They wanted to be very impressive in the New World and showed their baking skills, although they had not so hired help. And they were showing off what they brought with them. And so it's a combination of taking your mother and grandmother's recipes from England over on the boat. It collides with different ingredients, different peoples, different methods. The days were hotter and quite different. The crops are different. So trends, they by all these collisions, there's, taste change and they veer off a little bit. But I think there's a version of sugar pie, just like lemon pie, in most places, because it's very, very simple. It's, sugar and crust, basically.
I will say I've never heard of sugar pie before.
Okay.
No, it's a good segue, Kristen. I was going to ask it. So everyone sort of has a pie nostalgia, like I mentioned, the pies of your childhood. And I haven't met very many people who are from further north than I am. I'm originally from Calgary, Alberta, which is not that far. But Kristen has that credit. She is originally from Alaska. And I wanted to ask what kinds of pies you grew up with.
Yeah, so the main kind of pies that we made growing up, we didn't make pies frequently. When I was growing up, especially getting fresh produce in Alaska is, perennially a challenge. We often did blueberry and rhubarb, two things that grow plentifully where I'm from. And then we also had, made apple pies and pumpkin pies for holidays, and especially for American Thanksgiving. I perhaps have a benefit that my grandmother grew up in Washington State, and she moved to Alaska before it became a state, before it was officially a state, and it was still a territory. Where she grew up in the small town in Washington State, her family ran a really small little restaurant bakery, and she was kind of a short order chef making pie crust. That was one of her first jobs, was waking up and making pie crust. So she taught me how to make pie crust when I was young, but I somehow live here and don't have a rolling pin and had to borrow Jacquelyn's. So, but yes, it was mostly blueberry and rhubarb, I would say, and then the holiday pies. Those were the main things. I did look up today to see if there was an Alaska state pie, and there is, and I've never heard of it. It's called pirog, which is a version of Russian salmon pie. It's apparently especially big on the island of Kodiak. I'm not sure if you're not from that area, if you know what Kodiak is. I'm seeing at least one nod. It's a very large island that I went to several times when I was young. And it mainly consists of root vegetables like rutabaga and carrots, other things that grow very plentifully in Alaska, with either salted or canned salmon. Again, something really common where I grew up. But I've never had that, but we didn't have as great of a Russian influence in the area where I grew up as compared to some other areas of Alaska.
There is some overlap between Alaska and Alberta because rhubarb is a common ingredient there. Definitely fruit and rhubarb pies were common in Alberta. And of course, like I said, banana cream and lemon meringue. I think my household was highly influenced by Betty Crocker. Who has a Betty Crocker book on their shelf? I see a couple of hands. And who's it? Maybe everyone else is just embarrassed. The brand was prolific, and we have a lot of examples in our collection here. I pulled a couple that are in the display case outside. For those of you in person, you can go and have a look. Betty Crocker I was dismayed to realize is not actually real. I didn't know that.
I didn't know that.
I didn't know that until I came here as a graduate student, and Natalie Cook was a guest lecturer in my class that day. And that's when I learned that Betty Crocker was never real. She's entirely fiction. Part of that machine that markets recipes to homemakers, and an ideal person who, if in recent times, is now a spoon and no longer a woman. So if you can go and buy a Betty Crocker pie pan at Dollarama, and her logo is now a spoon. But anyway, that's Betty Crocker, very important influence on the pie culture in my home. I think a good segue there, away from my home. Pie is in many ways having a moment, not because of us and on Pie Day yesterday, but if you particularly actually on social media, there are a number of beautiful Instagram accounts entirely dedicated to the art of pies.
Yeah.
And that's not all. There's a lot. It's popular. It's definitely having a moment. So during the pandemic, I think that probably had a bit of an influence. A lot of us turned to baking or other hobbies as a way of keeping our hands and minds busy, and also just indulging in comfort food. Marcy, what do you make of the recent interest in the last few years in pies? You've seen it as a professional, perhaps.
Yeah, I think it's never quite had its moment. I think people focused a lot on like layer cakes gets a lot of attention as far as decorating them, and it's a celebratory type of thing. People are going to make a cake and they'll want it decorated. And I think pastry intimidates people a little bit, so it didn't get as much notice. And I think as people, I think I always think there's three, like if Freud had been a chef, it would have been fear of pie pastry, egg whites, and yeast. Those are the three major baking traumas. But I think as people got maybe a little bit better, or I think if you inspire someone actually like on TikTok or social media to be artistic, I think they'll override their fear. They'll leapfrog over the fear of the pie dough. They'll get the pie dough done. And then people get very inspired by making really beautiful pies. And there's a lot of, I forget the name of a colleague of mine. I think it's Erin McDowell, who does like extraordinary things. They're just, some of them I don't know if you don't even want to cut into them. And they tint the pie doughs, or they roast rhubarb and they cross-hatch the rhubarb. And absolutely, there's no limits on what you could do artistically. And it's a little bit, it's very accessible. It's a little bit easier in some ways than cake. And dietarily speaking, it's a little bit lighter, I think. But I think everything in food, because of social media, has become so visual and so artistic that it's affected everything from, like massive cookies to the best looking sourdough bread to the cakes, and pies were inevitable. And, pies are very romantic. Nobody looks at a woman toting a pie and gets crappy, or a man. I think it's just a very hospitable and kindly looking type of dessert, and very approachable. But prettier it's about time they got prettier. And they're fun. It's very, very relaxing. If you like any handwork is kind of relaxing, and cutting out little flowers and daisies or making the crust. And I think also Martha Stewart too had a hand in that, like in the 70s, early 80s. She came out with a pie book, and no one remembers, but she also began making them a little bit more polished and upscale as well.
One of the things I noticed in hunting for recipes here is that the 1950s in particular, if you look at our collections, the number of books about pie explode in that late 1940s and early 1950s era. And I think one of the things that might merit further investigation would be the changes in those recipes at that time. And I know you had looked at your recipe dates from what, 1915?
Mm-hmm.
And did you look at others from different eras in comparison?
I only compared to modern vegan bloggers for ideas of a couple of substitutions. I didn't look at any other historically.
I'm not blaming. I was just wondering, well, the contemporary comparison is useful. What did you notice changed significantly?
Oh, well, directions are pretty helpful, which we don't see in a lot of the more historic, the older recipes. in the older recipes in like the 1915 cookbook, we see a lot of assumptions made about the competency and the knowledge of the cook. And I think of them more as, Jacquelyn and I have noticed before, this is also true of older or vintage knitting patterns. We're both avid knitters. And we see when we look at vintage patterns, there's a lot of assumptions about what one already knows. So I think of a lot of these older cookbooks as almost better teaching tools, something that's, a mother and a daughter might use together so that you would learn what a quick oven is, and you would know how thin you're supposed to roll your pie crust and all of those kinds of things that are a little bit more mysterious to me as someone who doesn't make pies too often. So that's something that I noticed that changed. I also, in looking at the contemporary recipes, a lot of the historical ones that I looked at are much more basic in terms of the spices being added, for example, or the number of overall ingredients. Whereas the contemporary ones I was comparing with, the recipe that I used, I think, had 5 ingredients for the filling, whereas a contemporary vegan carrot pie had something more like 12. So a much larger number, which is something that I thought was a little bit funny, because a lot of people talk to me about how, vegan recipes are too hard because the ingredients are too weird. And then I looked at all these numbers of recipes and thought, okay, some of these are a little weird and a little hard, more than they need to be. But that was a big change that I noticed between those ones that I was looking at.
Yeah. There's a definite change in the instructions. I was looking again at my new Galt instructions, and the entire recipe is one sentence. It just says 1 cupful sifted flour, 1/2 cupful shortening or butter, 1/4 cupful water, and a little salt. And that's it. It doesn't give you anything in terms of instructions.
I did think it was funny that and this might be because I chose a cookbook by a flour company, right? But every direction about the flour is much more, sift the flour, sift the flour, sift the flour. And then for the filling ingredients, it's just, there's no instructions at all. And so I'm over here hoping that putting it all into the bowl and whisking it is the right thing to do, right? But much more attention paid to the flour, or maybe to the dry ingredients overall as compared to the wet ingredients. But that might just make sense for a flour cookbook, right? To pay more attention to what you're supposed to do with the flour. So
yeah. And there's actually, I remember, it's remarkable, Marcy, that you still have 80 pounds of velvet touch cake and pastry flour at your home.
It was a pandemic thing, like I got nervous.
So you're the reason that I couldn't find white flour for
no, not quite just me, but yeah, in part.
No, not quite just you, but there definitely was a moment there where I was the other producers, empty shelves, and all the like. But maybe you can speak to some of the insecurities that people have when approaching pastry. Like, you've been managing Better Baking for a long time. What advice do you give to people? Like, how do you keep in mind success when you design a pastry recipe? Like, how can we improve?
It was interesting what Kristen said. When I create a recipe, I try and think, how could I make this like almost a haiku? Because I think we have such short attention spans. And if you see a lot of text on a page or online, you're going to associate that with difficulty or a skill level beyond your own. So I try and make my recipes very streamlined. And I try and think, okay, what are most people's skill level? What are they able to do? So from that personal as a professional is what I do. But I would advise people, look for recipes that speak to you, that have a can-do feeling about them, have pantry available ingredients. You're not going out to get like, a 1/4 teaspoon of saffron on a Saturday night or things you don't have. From authors or from personalities that you resonate with, or that you trust. And a lot of times people, like in any endeavor in life, whether it's pie making or it's ceramics, they'll stop right in the middle. And they're like, the success part is 1 or 2 yards past that. If they would just persist, it will work out. And I guess the last thing, especially during the pandemic, people were heavily into bread, and they didn't want to make just like baking powder biscuits or a simple bread. No, it had to be like a 72-hour sourdough. And they go right from sort of like Pillsbury biscuits to like hard. Even for me, it's a bit of a challenge, and I had to work on that myself. And it's like an all or nothing approach, I think, to baking. But there's always a recipe if pies are your thing and you never graduate to cakes or breads, that's fine. But I think with bakeries disappearing, and there's many good bakeries in the city, but if you're looking for sweet things like cookies or scones or even pies, all cities are short on bakeries, and that tradition is no longer that popular. So you're going to have to make it at home. And or come to my site. I have a thing saying ask a baker. And I have so many random people that don't know my cookbooks, don't know the site, but they just Google ask a baker and they come to my door, and I get some odd questions and I'm happy to answer. It's I think any skill, baking certainly one of them, is very empowering. And just like, converting things to vegan recipes, it's also necessary sometimes. And by your own experience in the kitchen as a vegan cook and eater, what may work and what may be pleasing, and it's helpful to do it yourself.
It's a good transition here. We can have Kristen speak up a little bit more about how she veganized her pie. Mine is definitely not vegan. I went out and bought expressly lard because I didn't want to use shortening, because there are some downsides to shortening and margarine. And depending on the research that you read, I'm an advocate for all the animal fats, the butter, the lard. And unfortunately, that's not an option for a lot of people. And whether it's for ethical reasons or diet reasons, there's a lot of people who are vegan these days. So if you are, don't eat the lemon pie and stick with the carrot pie. And tell us, what's the fat in your crust?
Yeah, so my recipe called for a small cup of lard. Not entirely sure what a small cup is. I went with a 3/4 cup and then increased as I thought I needed. This year I just used
That's a better approach than I did.
Not increasing.
No, just using a standard modern cup and ignoring the fact that it probably wasn't right.
I just did the best I could. But I just used vegetable shortening this year. Last year I just used vegan butter. What some vegan food bloggers suggest doing is to do half and half vegan butter and vegetable shortening. That's supposed to give you both the best taste and the best texture. I'm kind of convinced that no matter how hard I try, I don't make pie enough that the texture of my pastry is ever really going to be perfect. So this year I just did vegetable shortening, and I think that my crust this year is better than my crust last year. So I'm excited to see how soggy the bottom is.
What about coconut oil?
I imagine that would probably be an option as well. That would definitely give you a very particular taste.
Yeah.
And may not be, so that might be a taste that would lend itself very well to a coconut pie, which is one of the recipes on the same page as my carrot pie because of the alphabets. And there are a number of other options as well that you could do instead of a kind of regular pastry crust. In fact, I decided to, in preparation for today, I looked to see what's the oldest printed vegan cookbook, and I found it, and it's been digitized, and it's from 1874. It has an entire chapter on pies, which includes 6 different crusts.
And where in the world?
Including wheatmeal based, oatmeal based, and potato based. Maybe next year I'll try potato based because that sounds pretty interesting to me. It's an American cookbook. There does seem to be one published in the States as well earlier in the 1840s, but it's one that there's a review of out there in a very old Vegetarian Society journal, but I find no trace of the actual book. So maybe if we can add it to the cookbook collection at some point, but you have to be able to find it to buy it. So
yeah. Marcy, do you want to speak to some of the substitutes? Like, I know a lot of people have dietary restrictions. If I tried to make a pie for my partner in life at the moment, it would be basically made out of meat. It would be a meat pie with a meat crust, because that's the diet that is allowed at the moment. So I live with a near carnivore at the moment.
That might just be end up being a sandwich if it's a 3-layer.
That's a fair point.
Just hold the bread. I was just thinking though, Kristen, what about taking like a mild flavored olive oil and making it cold till it coagulates into a solid, and using it's kind of almost neutral. It will get hard like a hard fat, and maybe use that. One day you could use that as a substitute. But yes, I do get people with allergies, people who are, gluten-free or gluten sensitive, or simply needing a lot of attention. There's a joke, how do you know someone's gluten-free? They will tell you. But aside from that, I have one of my sons has nut allergies, and I think there's nothing I've made in nuts that I've tested that it might say walnut biscotti on my website, but I've tested it with minced up graham cracker crumbs that give a similar taste to, let's say, crunchy walnuts or something like that. But there's generally, you're better off using something that starts in a normal way rather than tweaking and doctoring up and repurposing and restructuring something so that doesn't have any resemblance to its original roots, and yet dietarily it's correct that it may not be tasty. But there are substitutes. There's more and more things available, and more healthy things available as substitutes, not just dietarily correct, but actually nutritious and flavorful as well. So the world's your oyster as far as ingredients go now.
One of the things that pie does not have going for it, the sweet pie anyway, is sugar is much less popular or more vilified than it ever has been before. And Marcy dropped off her pie earlier today, and she was mentioning the change in sugar consumption of the average amount. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think I've lost the dates since we spoke an hour or two ago, but around 1750 or so, people were having about, I think at one point, 100 grams of sugar a year per person. Then it slowly went up to 1.6 kilos. And now I think, let's say worldwide, maybe North America or England, we're at 26 kilos per person a year. And I don't know how natural a sweet tooth is to people. I think it's grown over time. But that's changed. And now it is vilified. But if you ever look, first of all, the sugar substitute industry, like all the, we're not talking about stevia, we're talking about aspartame, things like that. Their budget for advertising is like massive compared to the Sugar Institute. So too much sugar is definitely not good, but a lot of these substitutes are also not good for anybody. But if you're diabetic, there are some really reasonable good things out there that you can try that are not, sheer chemicals or carcinogenic anyway. So there's a lot more out there, but I think also people are just used to sugar as the flavor in a lot of foods. I noticed that in ice cream, it's bereft vanilla sometimes, a plain ice cream, but it's just so full of sugar. You get addicted to that cold, smooth texture and the sweetness, but there's not a lot of dimension going on in a lot of products. Sugar has become the main flavor, basically. Salt too, for that matter.
Salt, sugar, fat, acid, heat, isn't that the whole title?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's definitely true. And I can guarantee that there's plenty of sugar in all of our pies.
Yes.
Today, we're going to open it up for questions. If anyone in the room has a question, you can come up to the microphone in the center there and ask it. And if you're on Zoom, I ask that you put them in the chat and we can voice them on your behalf. We did have one that come in already asking if you can have these recipes that we made today. And the answer is absolutely yes. We can share both the links to the original sources, and Marcy has very generously offered to share her recipe. We'll send it out in email form after the event. But yes, put your questions in the Zoom chat and we'll voice those on your behalf. Stephen has a question.
What is vegan butter?
What is vegan butter?
Vegan butter is usually based on a blend of oils like soybean oil and palm oil, but there's many different kinds. There's soy-free kinds, but the most common brands that people like is called Earthbound's Buttery Sticks. I'm not marketing for them. It's just the most typical one that we use.
So it's not, because you can buy dairy-free margarine.
Margarine's always been vegan.
Right. Well, it's not always. Sometimes there are margarines that, if you look carefully, does have dairy in it.
Well, that is not something that I would like. I don't often use margarine. Is often used as the basis for vegan frostings, like for cupcakes. No, I've never had success with that personally.
There is a margarine recipe book in the collection if you want to explore some things. We have a margarine recipe book in the collection if you want to explore some things. And it's actually an older product than you would think.
Mm-hmm.
It emerged in the 1800s. We have a question in the room. Go ahead.
There are two things on my mind. The first is a class question. So I think we think of pies as being sort of home-based thing, and I wonder if it's always been the case. Has there ever been a time where it was an upper class thing, and if so, what was that story? And has it also always been sweets thing versus has it ever been more savory as a meat-based pies? And the second thing on my mind is I'm Hungarian, and we don't have a pie culture per se. We have a strong strudel tradition, which unless you were taught at birth, you don't know how to make it.
That's what the bakery is for.
So I also wonder if keto must be one of those things that you have to buy really unless you're taught in a very traditional way. I guess I've also go to what that's like to not have it be a homey thing, but always a story.
Well, thank you. Did you hear that all right, Marcy?
Not quite clearly. Yes, I know strudel was operative. If you could just elaborate.
Well, the first part of the question was dealing with the class connotations of pie, and it does make me think of upper crust. But I don't have an informed answer for that. I don't know. Do you have a perspective, Kristen? You want to take that one?
Yeah, so I'm trained as a late medieval and early modern historian, and that's kind of like the, let's say 1300s to 1700 about. And that's when I started looking into kind of food history, and I was really interested in medieval banquets. It's a lot of what I looked at, and there were certainly many pies on medieval banquet tables for the upper class, sometimes with savory fillings. Peacock was a favorite, for example. And yes, I'm sure we've all enjoyed a peacock pie a time or two. Pies were also used in medieval banquets as moments of surprise. There's nursery rhymes, right, of people popping up. Yes, exactly. And that did in fact happen on medieval tables. There was lots of adding elements of surprise or unusual things to the table, so that it was a feast, not just for the palates, but also for the eyes and kind of an overall experience. And so pies certainly were on the table of the upper class, at least at that time. And then I kind of have a big gap in my knowledge of history after that. So
I think there definitely was a period where pies were a working class food.
The hand pie in particular,
Yeah.
I think of, because you can work and hold that at the same
Yes.
time.
And it's also easily transportable. So there was that aspect in history where a pie crust is actually a great way to transport the contents inside. It is your like Tupperware of a previous era. And to the point where I know at one point pastry was actually like discarded. You wouldn't even eat the pastry. That was just a container to transport what was inside, which actually is kind of how I feel
Yes,
about
you may also discard my little spine test.
We have another question in the room here. Go ahead.
Just very much related to what you were saying. My husband comes from England. He was saying the class thing with pie too. The Cornish pasty was carried about by workmen, that they would be made in the morning and they could pack it. It's very portable. They could take it, and one half of it was the savory pie, and the other half was the dessert pie. And I tried
In the same crust?
in this, yeah, which is part of my question, because as a surprise for him for Father's Day, I was trying to make a picnic, and I tried to make a Cornish pasty, and perhaps Marcia can say how you keep the two fillings from bleeding into each other.
This sounds like a great Canadian baking show challenge.
There's actually someone else in the chat on Zoom who's commenting about Cornish pastries as well. So your minds are thinking along similar lines. Marcy, do you want to speak to that?
The question about the dual filling that's leaching into each other.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how they did it originally, you're probably best off to maybe pre-cook each filling a little bit. So there's a little, they're thicker and they're more gluey, and they probably would leach a little bit less. You could also put like a little piece of pastry.
Thinking like make a wall of pastry.
Or make two like lung size or two, angel size separate pies, and then put them together in the oven a little bit. I mean, it depends if you want to be authentic or if you want it.
Do you want it to work?
Yeah, to be honest, I'd have to research it, but I know I mean, that was miners going into the mine had pies and they were easy to tuck into and they're fortifying. They're, carbs and a nice filling. And it was easy pretty well. I think empanadas are very, very much like that. And I've done those quite a bit. I just want to mention the class differences. I think, especially in New France, I think upper classes had a lot more access to imported ingredients, and wealthy relatives could be sending them things, or they could just afford the pricier things that came off that arrived in the port. Whereas people on, more on budgets, to more modest farmers, or the mainstream population was using things that were more indigenous, or you're going to buy staples. You're not going to buy like the preserved pigeon. You're going to buy, brown sugar or tobacco or tea or coffee, probably is where your food money is going to go. So I think the class there, the budget you have for those for luxury ingredients and things is going to be a little bit different.
Preserved pigeons is a fun thing to drop into a sentence. That one, I did come across, there's a lot of recipes for pigeon pie. That is very, very common savory pie. So if you want to be adventurous, maybe you can wade into
Some preserved pigeon.
preserved pigeons for pigeon pie.
Or peacock.
Or peacock, absolutely.
Yes,
And then
or
you could
blackbird.
design your pastry with the same color palette as a pigeon tail, and it would be beautiful. Well, thank you all for questions. We have one more, and I am afraid there's no easy answer for it. This came in via Zoom from Elaine about celiac disease and how many things, even spices, have flour fillers in them. And it's very true. My mother is celiac, and over the years, going back to the very rawest of basic single ingredients was the answer. So scratch cooking makes it safer, is my short answer. Mixes are helpful when you're trying to do a nice crust. It's helpful because sometimes those celiac mixes call for a little bit of potato starch, some tapioca starch, some millet flour, and a huge combination of different substitutes to make that same gluey texture. We have one more question in the room. We have time probably for the last one, and then I'll invite Chris up for some closing comments. Yeah, go ahead.
My question would be around what's the process around writing a pie recipe? Do you get inspired by books, or do you just kind of inspired by things in your environment? I'm just curious about how you write.
So Marcy, what's your process about writing a pie recipe? Where do you find inspiration?
The inspiration, like dreams of sugar plums, keeps me up at night. It comes from everywhere. It comes largely, you look out the window and rhubarb is coming. So things like that, ingredients, seasonal ingredients. You look at trends, you look at tastes, even contemporary film or books I'm reading. They might mention something. In the book, The Help, they just rave a lot about caramel layer cake, which is a Southern specialty. And that will send me on a whole, thing in that direction. I think pies also, I'm always looking for things with more global flavors that are a little bit more interesting, or the presentation. I'm always looking for something that looks fantastic, tastes awesome, and is really low rent in labor. Because I can't bake for everyone, so I'm trying to find recipes that are simple but really outstanding, like showstoppers. But inspiration comes from almost everywhere. We mentioned rhubarb being part of Calgary and Alaska. Certainly, I think when McDonald's came to Quebec, we're the only place, I think, in the world that had rhubarb pie. I guess the Maritimes as well. There was a little rhubarb, there was apple pie and rhubarb pie because it's so important to Quebecers. But then when I was doing the pie for this workshop today, I thought maybe I'll roast rhubarb. And I put that, and I did. And I roasted rhubarb, put it on the bottom of the sugar pie, and then poured the sugar creamy ingredients over it, baked it. So when you slice into it, and I don't have it nearby, you get that beautiful, decadent caramelized filling, and then that tart rhubarb at the bottom, which is I thought, this balances it. This doesn't have anybody saying, I like it, but it's too sweet. This is like perfect tart and sweet notes. So short answer, my ideas come from pretty well everywhere. I'm very small C, non-Catholic in my inspirations, I guess.
I'll put in a final closing plug for the cookbook collection as a source of inspiration. So they are open to all. And I'll say, if you're curious, send us an email. You can email me directly or roar.library@mcgill.ca. And on that note, I'll pass the microphone back to Chris for some closing comments, and then we will taste our pie.
What a delicious hour that was. So I want to thank Marcy, and I want to thank Kristen, and I want to thank Jacquelyn for that. And I want to thank all of you for your questions. That was a great deal of fun. Of course, I sat here thinking about pies in my life and pies I've known and pies that I've loved. And funny talking about the archives. I've mentioned this story before. My grandmother from Northern Ireland in background learned from her mother-in-law, who's Southern Irish, tourtière, standard tourtière pie. And it had been handed down for generation to generation. And Julian Armstrong had a best tourtière contest. And so my grandmother entered, and she got written up in the newspaper with everything. Oh, this is a good traditional tourtière, except there's too much salt. And then my grandmother, in response, I remember this clearly, said, "Oh, what did she know?" And the funny thing was, we have Julian Armstrong's archive here, and in going through and looking at it, there was my grandmother's letter with the recipe and the story behind it in her archive. So that was really fun. And my wife, we were in Lunenburg 21 years ago or so, and we got a Nova Scotian cookbook and had a wonderful beef and cheddar pie recipe, which is just outstanding. It's sort of like the more simple they are, the more wonderful they are. So we would have invited you here to try some of the pie that's in the room, but I've just got noticed that there's a fire drill, and so you're all going to have to leave. So I'm really sorry. The exits are there and there. And the pies are there and they stay there because the fire marshal says you're not allowed to carry pies with you. Anyway, I want to thank you all very much. McGill 24, if you are looking for a good cause, I'm biased, but I recommend if you can go online and support us, that would be just so wonderful. And I don't know, Stephen, do we have a number? We're gonna have like a big thermometer here, right? Or I don't know. It should be, yeah, it's cooking, baking, right? You have thermometers, you're baking thermometer.
We're at 135.
Or 135, so we'll go at 90 more. 90 more. So there are about 30 people in the room. If each of you donates 3 times, we're in the money. Anyway, in that case, maybe I'll let you stay. But we have to reach 225, then you can have some pie. Anyway, thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you.
An enormous thank you to Marcy. We'll show the room again here before we sign off.
Thank you all. I appreciate you coming.
Okay. Goodbye to the Zoom. Sorry that you can't join us for pie.